father's there, and he sent me a letter that said, "How would you like to spend the summer in Vietnam?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." I mean, I'm in the, want to go into foreign service. This is what's happening in overseas. Sure. And so I said, sure. Now, the advantage there was that because USAID recruited so many older men, they had families, and the families could not live in Vietnam. And so they established a number of what were known as safe havens. Manila was one, Bangkok was one, Taipei was one, where you could elect to send your dependents. Otherwise, you ended up spending an 18-month tour with one visit home. And if you brought your family over, your tour was extended to 2 years, but you had more opportunity to visit. And so I, after my sophomore year, was come back to Manila anyway. That's where we lived. And so it was a very easy deal just to get on a plane from Manila to Saigon. Nobody knew anything. I got no permissions, anything along that line. My father made an arrangement with a Protestant missionary that he had come to know in Da Nang. And I said, sure, I'll go. I'll work for free. I'll do anything you want me to do. This sounds great.
You want to go into the Foreign Service. This opportunity arises to go with USAID to Vietnam. And so you return to Vietnam in 1970, and now you're further south. You're no longer in I Corps in northern South Vietnam, but now you're in 2 Corps, and then you go down to Saigon later on. What did your work with USAID involve? You were an advisor. You're in your 20s. You're being sent to Vietnam to be an advisor. What was this all about?
Well, in all honesty, it was a certain amount of Western American hubris there. On the theory that a 22-year-old American could go advise a Vietnamese in his 40s who'd been doing this business for several years. Now, there were a lot of reasons for this, and they were largely good reasons, okay? Now, I was hired to be a refugee advisor. Technically, that was a relief/rehabilitation advisor. And that turned out to be very important because there weren't too many of them. Now, mind you, there were always more slots available than there were civilians in Vietnam to fill them. About the only specialty, I think, that probably had a close to full representation was police advisor, simply because every province needed advice with the police. They would send others, development advisors, education advisors, refugee advisors, to where they were needed. Now, in my case, I was sent to Lam Dong province, which is the southernmost province of 2 Corps. You literally leave 2 Corps when you leave the south end of, and you leave the Central Highlands very abruptly, as a matter of fact. Now, I was sent there because of a special effort that was about to take place. Now, Lam Dong itself was not a major event. There was nothing happening. There weren't many soldiers there, anything along that line. In other words, there were no internally generated refugees. What I got was about a week after I arrived in province, okay, Air America planes started showing up. We eventually got 10,000 Vietnamese refugees from Cambodia.
Wow.
Okay, this was after the 70 coup that had removed Sihanouk. Now, a number of people utilized that coup, that transition, to settle some old scores, among them racial. The Vietnamese constituted largely the business middle class of Cambodia, particularly in the cities. Really? And so people saw the opportunity to make some money, to get rid of the foreigner, to do any number of interlocking beneficial things. And so a sort of pogrom of anti-Vietnamese took place in Cambodia. And something like 250,000 is the best number I've been able to find, were actually moved out of there in some way or another. I got 10,000 of them.
Wow.
And they were not the ordinary refugees. They weren't mostly rural, for example. Most of them were urban oriented. Many of them had skills. One little lady had a restaurant. She brought her tables and chairs with her. One guy had an old British motorcycle. It was a very unusual group, but they had been thrown out of the country into which most of them had been born and raised all their lives.
Wow. Were you able to communicate with them? You mentioned that before you go to Vietnam the second time, you go through a year of language training. You learn the South Vietnamese dialect, and of course, within that, there are differences in different places within South Vietnam. And one of the things you say is that at least at one point, you're among a lot of folks who had come down from the north in the 50s, and so they spoke a northern Vietnamese dialect, which was difficult for you to understand. Were you able to communicate with these folks who had come out of Cambodia? Was that difficult?
That was easier to do because most of them seemed to have a southern accent of Vietnamese. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time talking to them. The job really didn't involve that. My major problem was the fact that most of the officials of the government of Vietnam in Lam Dong were Northerners also, except for the province chief. And so when I initially got there, there is a considerable difference between the northern and the southern dialects. The north is much harder, much harsher.
Sure.
And I was very much at sea for a while, but gradually you pick these sort of things up. And so I was able to communicate pretty decently, I think.
I did want to ask you one question, because you're among these folks who had come down from the north in the 50s, presumably not wanting to live under communist regime. I imagine a lot of them are Catholic.
Yes.
Did you detect among them a commitment to the preservation of South Vietnam? One of the themes that comes up in your memoir is how a lot of South Vietnamese seemed not to be committed to the government itself, and we can talk about why that was. Did you detect any difference between these folks who had come down the decade before from the north? Did they seem to be more committed to the preservation of the South, or was there no discernible difference?
They were definitely more committed, largely because they were Catholics, and that it had been their village priest who had probably inspired the first move. And as the war had continued, they were very pro-GBN. My comments that I made in the book about less dedicated simply apply across the board to almost everybody. I cannot tell you how many times I listened to a South Vietnamese tell me that the people in the South were actually weaker and lazier than the people in the North. This was a standard assumption on the part of South Vietnamese that the North were tougher. And this boded very poorly for us.
You've got the refugees who had come from North Vietnam in the 50s. You have the refugees coming from Cambodia. If there is any such thing as a typical day, what might you be doing with USAID? A young college graduate from the States in your early 20s, you're there as an advisor. What might a typical day look like there?
Well, typical days tended to be rather typical, I have to say. In other words, a lot of repetition in that sense. Now, I wasn't just a refugee advisor. I had some side jobs to do. And I probably lived one of the most comfortable wards of any American. They actually gave me a 2-bedroom house in Lam Dong to live in, all by myself, with 4 Montagnard guards at night. And so in the morning, I would just get up. I would usually, as I said, get my breakfast. I love Vietnamese bread. And so I would just go down and find some kid or something selling some in a little plastic bag by the roadside, give him a little bit of money and have my breakfast. There was a fairly substantial MACV base just outside of Bao Loc, where the advisory team was headquartered, and it had the barbed wire around it, and it was ready for self-defense type of thing. And so I was frequently in and out of there. All of our various briefings, for example, our staff meetings with our province senior advisor would take place. When I left, my conclusion was that when the Vietnamese arrived, they were well taken care of. The GBN was ready. They had food, they had shelter, they had it pretty much well organized. And so that kind of went well. But the eventual question is, what do you do with these people? What are they going to do? And that they could never solve. Now, some of this, people solved it for themselves because, as I said, many of them were urban. And so they just simply went to some other urban area. They left. Now, of course, I left with the situation at hand more or less in suspense. What happens next? Is anything going to happen next? We've given the initial relief. They're established. We're giving them long-term relief. But what are they going to do? And I didn't find out. I never did find out.
So on a typical day, then, you're just sort of, just responding to demands of the moment, problems of the moment, like these?
Usually, yeah. Part of it was just simply
they need clothing or something like that.
Yeah, there would be occasionally little problems, that they came up that I could that I could work my way around. There were always some little oversight. I think I mentioned how we got just hundreds of cans of canned fish, but no can opener. And
Oh, yeah, I remember that story. Yeah.
and so I sent one of the girls out who worked for the refugee division there, who went out to the Lamdong market, which was very small, by the way. I mean, this was not a big place at all. She came back with about 1,000 of them. These are the American P-38 can openers that every veteran
that had made their way into the black market or
black market, exactly. And so I would go down there and spend my time. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, much of my time was spent doing things so that I could report back to my superiors. They wanted to know how many people were there, which, as I said, we never actually got an accurate count. They wanted to know how the progress was going and all that sort of thing. And so I was frequently briefing any number of people. I would brief my own province senior advisor, for example, or his deputy. And then I would get people coming in. Two-star generals would fly in on their helicopters and want a briefing about this project. And so I would be called on to give them a briefing, which basically meant I would go down in there and I would count how many were underway, how many had roofs on them, how many were inhabited of the new structures with the tents going down, this sort of thing. So far too much of that was spent pleasing the Americans and not the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese bureaucracy combines the worst elements of the French and the Chinese. And so while people coming into Vietnam, refugees, were under the control and the care of the what was known as the Ministry of Social Welfare, their land, were they to get somewhere in the neighborhood, that would have to be decided not by the Ministry of Social Welfare, but by the Ministry of Land Reform. And cross-ministerial communication was very, very rare. Okay, communication within the Chinese and French bureaucracy is vertical, largely, and it's top-down. If you see, I would frequently go in and talk to my counterpart, for example. He would say that, well, I have ordered this from Saigon, but it's taking a long time to get. I'm not sure why. And so we were always getting this kind of, well, we know what we need to do, we don't have what we need to do, and more important, we don't have permission. And that was absolutely important.
And this is just bureaucratic. This is a bureaucratic morass that you're stuck in. You can't get. It's extremely hard to get things done.
Very definitely. At about the 70 to 71, maybe into 72 timeframe, we thought we were winning. We really thought the tide was turning. Now we look back and we say, well, that's largely because the Viet Cong suffered such enormous losses in Tet of 68. That when the GBN pushed out into the countryside afterwards, as a part of what they called the Advanced Specification Program, they were pushing into a vacuum. And so at about 71 up to Easter Offensive of 72, pretty much everyone, except some of us, thought that the war was going to be won, that we were actually winning it.
Well, I wanted to ask you that. Does that we include you in mid-late 71? Did you think things were looking good?
No, I did not think so. It just seems to me that they kept forgetting the basic point. Okay, to go back to the real basic point to me is that the American effort forgot or never understood that the A in MACV stood for advisory. We decided we were going to defeat the VC, which we didn't, okay? And then we basically ignored the ARVN, and more importantly, we ignored the ARVN's structural problems. And so, although our task was to advise a military and a government to earn the respect of its people and the right to live in independence, which means the ability to defend itself, because that was what was at stake here. And we basically ignored that because initially we thought we could do it for them. And by the time we got around to paying some attention to the people themselves in pacification, the structure of the ARVN and the GBN was so incompetent and corrupt that we never really went after it.
Can you think of an example? When we talk about the government of South Vietnam, corruption almost inevitably comes up in the next sentence. Can you think of an example of just sort of corruption? And when we think of corruption, we could think of, elites, but you get into these systems where corruption just kind of pervades everything. So it could be just a tiny example. Does an example come to mind that illustrates the corruption you're talking about?
Well, I was told a story by a Vietnamese who attended this particular event, but I mean, I was not there myself. But it was during just before I left, and the commander of 2 Corps was in the Tron, and he and the province chief went to lunch at a nearby restaurant in town, civilian restaurant, and they were served by a young man waiter. And then the 2 Corps chief says, "What are you doing here? Why are you not in the army?" And the man says, "I am in the army." He says, "But my commanding officer lets me work this job full time if I give him half his money, have the money I earn."
Yeah.
And so another breakdown. Everybody stole from everybody.
Oh, so he's in the army, but he gets a plum job so long as he's paying off his officer.
Right. And this officer was probably no more than a captain or something, and he wasn't very high ranking in any way.
Is what you're describing a situation where whether you're actually accomplishing something or not isn't really as important as making it seem that you're accomplishing something in a report so that the person higher up the bureaucratic chain can then take your report, say, take someone else's report, write a report about those and send it up. And the reports look like stuff is happening, but in reality, there's not a whole lot actually going on. Is that that's
a fair statement? Yes, that is. That's pretty much how our reports were structured to operate. Now, most of this was human nature. Okay, I mean, when they wrote the report, they attempted to get hard facts. But remember that the vast majority of Americans who were there were only there for 1 year. You don't get into your job until almost the very end, and then you have to leave it. And so knowing that you have to leave it, knowing that you're going to get a report on how well you did, and you want to get a plum assignment next time, you don't like those reports coming up to you that indicate that people are suffering and people are dying. And so this got to be many problems this way, and with the Americans. Now, I personally never suffered that problem. My boss, both of them were top-notch individuals, but I knew a couple of people that about my age at that time who had been into areas, and they discovered that their superiors, who were military, did not want anything bad happening in their district or their province. Just you couldn't report it bad because that would affect them when they left. When I went there in 70, I was opposed to the war, but it was a theoretical type of thing. I knew more than just about anybody else in college about this real situation, sure. But 2 months is not enough to really learn a thing like that. And so over the space of 2 years, when I saw that our opponent had the stronger case and very much the better case, okay, why are we trying to help Vietnamese split into 2 countries? Well, there was an obvious reason for that, and we were following through on that. But the bureaucracy itself of American bureaucracy helped to do that. It helped to give me that opinion because I could see no way that we could get out of the morass, that we could change things. It was much too late. And so when I looked at that, and I had experiences, for example, I talk about how I, as a refugee advisor, was not allowed to do development work in province, even though we didn't have a development officer, because I was a refugee officer. That was my slot. Now I could go and do the work, but I couldn't sign off. I couldn't request things. I couldn't report. I couldn't do anything along that line. And so we took a long-standing bureaucratic tradition of America and implemented it on the Vietnamese, both in the military and in the civilian structure. We had it all thought out. Our advanced pacification program was going to go out into the villages, and we were going to teach them how to elect a village chief, an assistant village chief for security, an assistant village chief for development, and so on and so forth, and imposing a very definitely org type of structure on the Vietnamese who were the least interested and were not equipped to do that sort of thing. So we basically tried to implement a structure, both military and civilian, that required too much Western maintenance. We taught the Vietnamese how to fight the American way. You go out and you patrol. When you run into an ambush or something, you drop back, you call in air support. You call in artillery support. That's how you fight in America. Well, we taught the Arvin how to fight that way, and then we left. And the air support and the artillery support wasn't there.
Well, and you mentioned, I think you say in the book, there's There's a certain culture that goes along with maintenance, right? Maintaining the planes and keeping things organized, because this plane's going to break down or it's going to need repair, and that whole system breaks down. And after a while, this structure that's been built just doesn't work anymore.
Doesn't function. The breakdown is often the way to put it, because we made them motorized, both in the air and on the ground. I do make a mention in the book that we could not seem to teach the Vietnamese the concept of preventive maintenance.
Right. Yeah.
That's fantastic mechanics. Absolutely. You got a problem, they could fix it. But if you told them, well, you've got to do this every week or this every other day, it didn't get done. And so when you look at the military records, the ARBN's helicopters, very few would fly. Their trucks and their jeeps and their tanks were not, because we made them so dependent on Western culture and Western machinery. My superior in the chief of the refugee division had obtained a relationship with a man named Phan Quan Dong, who was the Minister of State of the GVN. Now, he was by far the most popular Vietnamese to Americans, absolutely by far. He was the one we could get along with, which means, of course, he had absolutely no chance of getting any power in the GVN. But he was, one of the things he was sent to do would be make these little dog and pony show visits. And I went on a couple of them with him. And because, you see, although he was, technically like the fourth ranking officer or something of the GVN, he couldn't procure an Air America aircraft. Only an American could do that. So Americans had to escort or be with him. And my superior really didn't like to do this as much. And so he would occasionally send me. And he sent me this morning, complete surprise. I had no idea what was going on. He just said, get out to the airport, find Dr. Don, we're going in a plane. And so I did. And this was one of my few trips down in the Delta. I really don't know the Delta very much. I never did learn it. To this, and even that very first day, I didn't know where we went. I don't know what provinces we ended up in. It was just around and around and around. Now, our first stop, for example, this was the flood season down in the Delta. And so the entire province that we went to was underwater, but for special areas that had been built up. And for villages, for example, or the administrative headquarters. And now, coming as someone from the Central Highlands, who were used to mountains, I'm looking out and all I see is water. As far as the eye can see. And so we were there primarily to try to raise the morale of this one province, because sometime before, and I never learned exactly when, the province headquarters had been overrun and the province chief had been killed. Now, this would have been a bad thing if it had been done by the BC or the NBA, but it had been done by the ARBN unit assigned to protect the province.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
The ARBN commander and the province chief were drinking cognac, playing poker, lost their temper at each other. The province chief threw the ARBN commander out of it. The ARBN got some of his soldiers, came back and killed people. Okay, and so I stayed out of the way. This was none of my business. I was just there because we had the airplane. So we did some sort of talking about that. Then we got back in helicopters this time, because the only way to get around the province for any sort of distance was helicopters. We flew for lunch at a Catholic church on one of these villages that is built up on stilts out of the ground. The village itself is laid out in a cross shape. Okay, and all of the front of the buildings were on the ground and all the rear were on pilings over the water, including the church. And I remember having lunch there. There was nothing special. We were having lunch, and there I see what looks like an American sitting next to the priest, okay, the head of the local village. And I'm not really close to them, but I can sort of hear them talking. And as I listen, I cannot figure out what language they're talking. It's not English, it's not French, it's not Vietnamese, and it wasn't Chinese. And so I had no idea. And there was an officer of the Macri team sitting next to me. And I said, what's going on over here? He said, okay, that's our pet priest. He said, he just showed up here one day. Now, this is unusual because the Catholics, since they ran the country, had a very organized relief effort. But this guy, apparently, for reasons we never found out, just decided to go to Vietnam, answer a calling, showed up. He met this priest who sort of took him in.
Now, and he was American, right? He'd come from
American. Yeah. He only spoke English. And the priest did not speak any English, but they communicated in Latin.
Wow.
After the lunch, we then went out to a district headquarters, which again, everything was underwater, but we actually landed on a floating pad in a helicopter. This was an Arvin helicopter, by the way, that we were flying in, which made me a little bit nervous because they didn't have a really great reputation, both for maintenance, and they were all good pilots, but they were still a shaky type of thing. And we went to the district headquarters. We met the district advisor, and he and the district chief got into boats, little basic rowboats with outboard motors, which is the only way you could get around. And so he took off, and we took off after him. We all got in a couple of boats, and the Americans were following the Vietnamese in the lead boat. And as we're sailing along, I had to remember that the water is only a few feet deep at that point. Okay, it's not that much, but so. It is only their part of the year. So we kept passing a lot of Vietnamese in sampans, those little low-lying boats that are out there. Now, something that meant a lot to me, the province chief, the Vietnamese, he would roar right past them, full speed, wake going, didn't care whether he upset the sampan or not. When the American went by them, we would drop to no wake speed, go by, and then go fast again. That was a telling metaphor to me about the attitude of the GBN towards its people. Now, after that little lesson, we ended up going to a fire base, a very small fire base. And it was actually 3 round circles of land that had been raised up above the high level of the water. On 2 of those circles sat howitzers. The third was where the men lived, their quarters. And around each howitzer was a semicircle of boxes, wooden boxes, holding the shells for the howitzer, which didn't strike me as a good thing to kind of cower behind if you were being attacked.
Right.
And some B40 wire fence out in the distance from not too far away from the place. But the point was, of course, it was indefensible. There was no way they could possibly defend. Now, attacking in the rainy season would have been hard, but they just weren't set up for defense. That was because they weren't planned to defend themselves. They were there to support by artillery other fire support bases within range. And they, in turn, were to be supported by the other fire support bases. It was a very typical American interlocking, complicated system. Now, the problem is we did this in the Delta. And so when the rainy season came, we had to shift howitzers. We would carry the 155s in the dry season and then fly by helicopter them out, fly 105s in and switch the ammunition. Well, when I got there, this being the rainy season, there were 2 105 howitzers there and the 2 boxes as revetments around the howitzers. And as I mentioned, I was standing there next to a brigadier general who I really wish I could remember his name. He deserves to be remembered. Who looked at me and said, "Do you notice anything strange about those boxes?" I'm a civilian. I don't really know. And he points out to me that all of the shells in those boxes are for 155 millimeter howitzers. They switched the howitzers, but not the shells. Those guns couldn't fire. The people who depended on them for support weren't going to get it. What about others? Did that happen in other ways? Was the support for this particular base inoperable also? Okay, we set up a situation that required them twice a year to helicopter howitzers in and out of a difficult place. And they couldn't do it. But nobody says anything. The entire event went off as planned. Dr. Don talked to the soldiers and made a little speech and inspected the place. And the fact that it was totally inoperable never came up. It deepened by what by that time I was already sure of, is that this whole message was futile, whether we were going to lose or they were going to lose after we left. I mean, I left in 72. By the way, Vietnam would have collapsed in 72 during the Easter offensive, were it not for American air power. We used tremendous, massive air power to support. Now in 75, there was no air power to call on. And so the inevitable happened, and I was sure it was going to. I was surprised it took that long.
What memories do you have of the Easter offensive?
Okay, most of those involve American bureaucracy. Okay, now we knew right away that when the North Vietnamese came across the border that we were going to be generating refugees, and in fact, many of them were already in refugee camps. They had to leave because of this new offensive. We got the phone calls from the headquarters in I Corps, and we started, trying to find out where tents were and food and all that sort of stuff. And then we all get called down a floor to have a meeting. And in that meeting, a major, U.S. Army major, whom I'd never heard before, never saw again afterwards, told us about how we were going to have to reorganize to meet this emergency. Now, I have no idea whose permission he got to do this. He must have gotten somebody's. But what he decided to create was what he called the Refugee Operations Center, which was him at a desk receiving everything from every province in the country and then allotting the tasks that needed to be done to the staff. Now, the civilians sitting there who'd been doing this exact same thing without him at this point in time, we were really upset. I was furious, absolutely furious at the time. This guy had no knowledge of refugees, no place. It was a bureaucratic power play.
So my interpretation of what you're saying is a major in Saigon, late in the war, the American operations are winding down, although, as you say, during the Easter Offensive, American air powers there, but he's a major in Saigon, so it doesn't sound like he's much just specifically involved in that. It seems like he saw this as an opportunity to build his career.
That's exactly what he saw it as. We didn't cooperate. We let him sit in the office and ignored it. Just went about our business.
So primarily then your recollection or your personal memories of the Easter Offensive is just this bureaucratic response in Saigon.
Right. That's where I was. I didn't get out.
Now let's move a few Aprils down the road, April 75. Of course, it's rolling. You can see it coming, as the NBA moves through Quang Tri and I-Corps and all the way down. Now we're right on the outskirts of Saigon. What memories do you have of your own response to all of that?
That event impacted me enormously, just enormously. And in retrospect, I'm surprised because, as I said, when I left, I thought it was going to happen. I mean, it wasn't a surprise in that sense. But the manner in which it happened, the complete and total collapse of authority and care and respect among all of the ARVN and the GVN. And the thing about that bothered me the most was not Saigon. It was II Corps. Now, that was, although most of the attention went to I-Corps, II Corps was a big problem also. And largely because the very first attack was at Bamituit, which was a provincial headquarters in II Corps. They threw the ARVN out, the ARVN reorganized, reattacked, and failed to take the province. Now, they had been way too far extended. Every military man knew this, but except for II, who wanted to make sure he had control of more people. But when this happened, II's order was to evacuate the entire Central Highlands. After he just gave up the fight and tried to send everybody. Now, the roads in Vietnam with which you would draw on are not very good. And in fact, because some of them were insecure, they ended up picking out a little known, almost dirt road to evacuate almost all of the military in II Corps. Now, General Phu, who I mentioned earlier, knew this was a disaster. When he got that order, he knew it. He flew it into Trang and nobody ever heard from him again. He just opted out of the whole thing. Now, what happened is that everybody in the ARVN who had access to helicopters and planes used them, which means the officers. That left the lower ranking officers and all of the soldiers still there having to get down to the coastline. And so they went out perhaps as military formations, but along the way, they gradually turned into a mob. The tanks, for example, because nobody could stop them, would push their way to the front of the line. You had to get out of the way of a tank. It wasn't going to protect you. It was going to be the first one in the tank if its commander had any say in the matter. There are a couple of apocryphal stories about a Vietnamese soldier riding a motorcycle. He gets shot. The motorcycle is picked up by the shooter. He rides until he gets shot. And this process goes on. So the motorcycle eventually arrives in the Trang. But how many riders did it take to get it there? It was a disaster. The Vietnamese called it the Trail of Blood and Tears. And because that was my area, I was seriously affected by that.